Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, I'm going to be going over another opening, and this is the French defense, and in particular, the Rubinstein variation. So without further ado, let's look at this opening. White starts off by playing e4, and black will play e6. So the French defense, d4, d5, knight c3, dE4, knight e4, and this is the Rubinstein variation. Knight to d7 is one move that black can play, and another one is bishop d7, which we're going to be looking at first. If bishop d7 is played by black, then white will just develop normally with knight f3, and black will play bishop c6. And usual ideas that black will get whenever he plays bishop c6 is to usually trade the light squared bishop off for the f3 knight. And this occurs quite often, not just in the French defense, but it can also occur in the Caro-Kann defense. If you've ever noticed that black will play bishop g4, and he'll trade the bishop off for the f3 knight. And then he'll play c6, and it's mainly because he wants to get rid of his bad bishop, the light squared bishop. So after bishop c6 is played, white will just play bishop d3. And after knight d7, castles, knight gf6, white now plays knight g3. You could take the knight on f6 or pin the knight with bishop g5, but knight g3, just preserving the knight, is better. And this is when black will play bishop takes f3. And he's giving up the bishop pair, but after queen takes f3 and c6, you can notice that his pawn structure is very solid. I mean, now there are options like knight to d5, and the knight is quite centralized. And even if white is going to play the move c4 and kick the knight away, the grip that black has on d5 is quite extraordinary, and even though the pawn might stay there on c4 for a while, black has methods of getting rid of it. So b3 by white, bishop to e7 by black, and now white just fianchettos his bishop, and black castles kingside. c4, gaining more space, and here there are two moves that black can play. One move is queen to a5, and another one is rook e8. If queen a5 is played, then white will play a3, getting ready to push b4, but also prevents moves like bishop b4 in the future. b5 will be played by black, and here c takes b5. c takes b5, and rook f to e1. And after this move is played, we notice that there are threats like knight to f5. And this is a threat because if you play e takes f5, then after rook takes e7, first of all, white has gotten rid of the bishop, and after that bishop falls, not only are there two very weak knights on these squares, but also the knights must stay and protect each other, otherwise there are attacks that white can use to easily win the game. So after this rook fe1 move is played, black will actually bring the knight to d5, centralizing the knight, and after knight f5 by white, this has already gone too far. If you capture the knight on f5 with e takes, you could just play the move queen takes d5 as white, and there's an attack on the bishop on e7, and there's an attack on the knight on d7. And next thing you know, the f5 pawn is also going to be lost. So e takes f5 is not the best move, and instead just playing knight 7 to f6, threatening the knight on f5, and letting the knight capture on e7 is better. So after knight takes e7, knight takes e7, white plays bishop c3. And the bishop cannot be captured, because if you do capture it, then after bishop takes h7 check, king takes h7, queen takes c3, white has a queen against two not very good knights. So queen takes c3 is not playable. Instead, black, after bishop c3 is played, will play queen to b6. And after this move is played, white should be a bit better, because he will play bishop to b4, and he's threatening the knight on e7, and rook a e8, and bishop c5. And believe it or not, black is actually going to lose a pawn. You may think, how is black going to lose a pawn? Well, black only has a few reasonable moves. If queen a5 is played, then white is free to just play the move b4, and if you play queen to a6, then white will play a4, and the pawn is pinned and you cannot defend it. So you must try queen a4 if you want to hang on to this pawn. But if you do play queen a4, then white has queen e2, not only threatening the b5 pawn, but if you defend it with a6, then white also has the option of playing bishop c2, which traps your queen. If you go queen to b8 as black, then you just allow a4. And here, black must play b4, because if you capture, then there's rook takes a4. And why is this losing for black? It's because you're threatening the a7 pawn. But not only that, black cannot capture the b3 pawn because there's a discovery and you lose the queen. The basic fact is that you can capture black's pawn, but black cannot capture your pawn. And that's the main reason why black is very much lost in this variation. So that is why after queen a5, it doesn't actually work. You are going to just lose the pawn. And also, it doesn't work if instead of queen b6, you try the move queen to d8. Because if you do this, then you just lose the pawn directly, and after knight fd5, bishop b2, queen b6 attacking the bishop, just bishop c4, and white's up a pawn, and he has the bishop pair, black has the knight pair, but it's not as good as the bishop pair. So that is queen a5. The other move that black could try is rook to e8. But if rook e8 is played, then white will play rook fe1, black will play bishop f8, white will play rook ad1, and now black will play queen a5. Bishop to b1 by white, just defending the a2 pawn, but also keeping the bishop on the lookout for the h7 pawn. And here, black will play g6, blocking the bishop's activity along the diagonal, and h4 by white. Bishop g7, and bishop c3, attacking the queen and forcing the queen to go back. The queen retreats to c7 and h5, so starting the attack and getting ready to play the move h6, which will weaken the f6 knight severely. b5 and now h6. After b5 is played, you could play the move c takes b5, but it's quite unnecessary because of the tactic that you're about to use. h6 is played by white, and here black is just in a very bad position. If you try the move bishop to h8 as black, then this allows just a simple bishop to d3. And this may not seem like much at first, but it is just trying to build up, and eventually this bishop on h8 is just going to be a very passive bishop. You don't even have to do anything if the bishop doesn't accept the pawn. You just have to play against a very passive bishop on h8. So instead of playing bishop h8, black decides to play bishop takes h6, capturing the pawn. But this allows white to play the move d5. And after d5 is played, you're losing the knight on f6. If you play the move knight to h5, then there's just knight takes h5, and this is already quite easy to understand why this is lost. Because after g takes h5, white can just play the move bishop h7 check. If you play king takes h7 as black, then queen takes f7 check is playable by white. And if you block with the bishop, then you obviously lose to checkmate. If you don't capture, then there's just d takes e6, and you're already lost here as black. You cannot capture the pawn back, and there's also an attack on the knight. That is why after the move knight h5, black is very much lost. So black is not going to play the move knight h5, and instead he's just going to take the pawn on d5. Now this is really lost, but after bishop f6, black makes another mistake. Black should really just play the move knight takes f6 first, and then after queen takes f6, then if you play b takes c4, you're fine. You have 3 pawns for the piece, and even though it might not seem like much at the moment, it sure can be proven to be doing something good later on. However, instead of playing the move knight takes f6, some people might mistakenly play the move b takes c4. Unfortunately, after bishop b2, this is already a bit too bad for black. Black will take on b3, and now white is just going all out. And I encourage you to pause the video and find the move that white will play that is just completely crushing. Okay, so white will play the move knight h5. And the idea is that if you play g takes h5, then white can just take on h7, king to f8, and queen takes h5. And there's an attack on the bishop on g7. There's a threat of bishop to a3. The attack is really prevailing for white. And if you play bishop g7, then bishop a3 check, and black is completely lost. If you play the move knight c5, then white will just play the move rook c1, and there's no way to defend this knight on c5. So this is completely lost for black. On the other hand, after knight to h5, if you don't play the move gh5, you could also try f5. And f5 is trying to solidify the position, and it's basically saying that even if you're going to get an attack, it's going to be very hard to do it. But white can easily break through black's defenses, and I encourage you to yet again pause the video and find out how. So white is actually going to play rook takes d5, and this is a very nice move. Point being, you're not only threatening the move rook takes d7 to win the knight, and then if the queen captures, play knight f6 check and win the queen, but you're also just breaking the position open. And it's really hard for black to respond after rook takes d5 is played. Usually black will just capture the knight on h5 because this is just too much already. And now white will just play rook takes f5. And this is the reason why the position is already way too much winning for white. If you don't capture the rook, then you're just allowing too much of an initiative for white. Like, let's say you play the move rook to f8. The move that white could just play that easily could win is just rook takes e6. There's no real material advantage, but if you just look at the activity of white's pieces, you already understand why white is better. Now, instead of playing the move rook to f8, black usually will play e takes f5. But this is already way too much lost for black, and after queen d5 check, king f8, this maneuver that will eventually lead to mate is very common. So that is why it's not really a good idea to play f5 or g takes h5. They just lead to a very bad position, and in general it also means that rook e8 is not a very good move. So instead of playing the move bishop to d7, black can also play the move knight to d7. And after knight d7 is played, white will play knight f3, knight gf6, bishop d3, and here black has a couple of moves to try. One is knight takes e4, one is bishop e7, and another one is c5. And we're first going to be looking at c5. And if c5 is played, then white will castle, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, knight f6, bishop g5, c takes d4, knight takes d4, and here black has three moves. Bishop c5, h6, and bishop e7. And if bishop to e7 is played, then white will play bishop f3, black will castle, rook e1, queen b6, knight b3, rook to d8, and queen to e2. And this is all normal development. Both sides are getting ready to maybe start an attack, get some counterplay on the other side. So bishop d7, bishop d2, bishop to b4, c3, and after bishop to d6, c4 by white. And c3 was originally intended to stop any bishop exchanges that were possible, and with c4, white is now also threatening the move bishop c3, which would get himself a very active position. He's also threatening the move bishop to a5, which threatens to win the exchange, and white should be way better in this position. Instead of playing this move bishop e7, black could also play the move bishop c5, and after this move is played, we would see c3, h6, bishop f6, queen f6, queen a4 check, bishop d7, queen c4, bishop d4, just some trades, and now queen b4. So threatening to attack the pawn on b7. And after this move is played, bishop to c6 could be played. And here white plays the move d5. And this is an interesting move that you might not see very often, because d5 is trying to sacrifice the pawn, but for a ton of initiative. And after e takes d5 is played, white will play bishop f3. And after bishop f3, what you can see that white is trying to centralize his rooks to e1, to d1, and the attack is really starting to push forward. Rook to c7 is one move, and another one is rook to d8. If you try the move rook to d8, then after rook fe1 check, king d7, and queen a5, white is definitely in a better position. He's threatening both d5, he's also threatening a7, and with an attack like this, I don't see how white is going to lose this game. So that is why instead you could try rook c7 as black, but this would allow rook a d1, rook d7, rook fe1 check, king d8, bishop to g4, rook to e7, and now a trade of rooks, and after queen f4 trying to infiltrate via this way, black will defend with queen c7, but now white plays queen d4. Now there's a threat on both g7 and the a7 pawn, and there's no way to really defend both pawns, so white is winning back his pawn. That is why instead of playing the move bishop c5, black will instead play the move h6. And after h6 is played, white actually has a very famous game to follow if you ever want to try beating this opening. and that is that white will play bishop f6, queen f6, and queen d3. And the game that's going to be followed from this, and it's a very interesting game that you can study if you ever want to know how to play the Rubinstein variation of the French a bit better, is the game Peter Svidler versus Evgeny Bereyev from 2004. And this game is actually a very nice miniature, and it shows how very quickly you could lose the game because of one insignificant move, and also because of not castling quite early. So a6 is played by Bereyev, Svidler goes rook a d1, and bishop e7. Bereyev is obviously trying to develop, and he's trying to castle. Knight c6 by Svidler, Bereyev plays e5, and now knight takes e7 by Svidler. And here, queen takes e7 is played. But you'll notice that there were many opportunities for Bereyev to castle, and you'll notice that he doesn't take any one of those opportunities. e5, knight e7, queen e7, and f4. And here was the perfect time for Bereyev to castle. If he just castles, then he's gotten his king to safety. He can easily develop pieces like f5, and then he can find a way to activate this rook. And he doesn't have to worry about ever-crushing threats towards his king in the center. However, that's not what Bereyev did. He didn't castle, and instead he just played ef4. And the crushing move that Svidler played that just won the game is what I will leave to you guys to find. So Svidler played the move bishop b7, and after this move was played, Bereyev is already very lost. If you play bishop b7 as Bereyev, then you just lose your queen, rook fe1. And if you play the move queen takes b7, then there's just queen d8 check, and that is lost to checkmate. If you don't do anything, and if you just castle, for instance, then after bishop a8, queen a7 check, queen to d4, queen takes a8, you'd be down the exchange, and this would be very hard for Bereyev to play. That is why it was just better to castle a lot earlier and just avoid all of this trouble. But after bishop b7 was played, rook fe1, this is already way too much for Bereyev, and he resigned here. So that is the move c5. Now, another move that you could play, instead of going for c5, is to play bishop e7. And if you play bishop to e7 as black, then white is just going to go for knight takes f6 check. And here black has a couple of moves to play. One is bishop f6, and the other is knight f6. G takes f6 can usually be played in other variations, but not exactly in this one. So after knight takes f6 is played by black, queen e2, castles, bishop g5, and now c5. dc5, queen a5 check, and now c3. And here black will regain the pawn with queen takes c5. And here white has two options. You can either play kingside castle or queenside castle. If you castle kingside as white, then after h6, bishop to e3, queen h5, bishop d4, bishop d7, knight e5, offering the queen trade. White is okay here. I mean, he's not really that bad. He's threatening to get the bishop pair with knight takes d7, and he's also threatening to play the move bishop f3. And I would say that this position is fairly good for white. It's definitely fine to play. You could also castle queenside, which is a bit more aggressive compared to kingside castling. And here, this is where a very complex variation will occur. In this position, black has two moves. You can either try g6 or h6. If h6 is played, then white will capture on f6, bishop takes f6, and queen e4. And after g6, h4, and an attack will easily start by white. If you don't play h6 and instead go for g6, then after h4, b6, h5, bishop b7, h takes g6, h takes g6. Here's a very interesting puzzle for you all. Find out what happens if white plays the move bishop takes g6. So white should play the move bishop takes g6. And you might think, well, what happens if bishop takes f3? I mean, not only are you threatening the queen, but you're also threatening the move queen takes g5 check, which would check the king, also fork the bishop on g6, and once the queen captures the bishop, how are you really going to start an attack? Well, you're not actually going to capture the bishop. You're going to play bishop takes f6. And if you play bishop takes f6 as black, then after bishop h7 check, king g7, queen takes f3, white is up a pawn. So you must play some move like queen g5 check. And this is where the position gets so tactical. Here, white, despite all that's happening here, white will just play the move rook to d2. And this is so hard to believe that white would find in a game. And it's so creative and so complicated at the same time. Point being that if bishop takes f6 is played, then you check, and after king g7, you lose the bishop. But if you play the move queen takes g6, you lose to checkmate on h8. And it's the same thing if you capture the bishop on f6 with the queen, just bishop h7 check, and then you lose the bishop on f3. But what happens if you play f takes g6? You're just going to capture the pawn on e6 with check, and after rook f7, rook h8 is checkmate. So there's really nothing to do to defend against the move rook to d2, and that is why bishop f6, bishop h7, and this variation is most preferred, among other things. So that is the end of the move knight takes f6. Now let's look at bishop takes f6. If bishop takes f6 is played, then white will play queen e2, and now black has two moves, c5 and castles. If castles is played, then queen e4, g6, bishop h6, rook e8, and queenside castles will give white a big initiative. And if black plays c5, then there's d5, knight to b6, bishop b5 check, king f8, dE6, bishop e6, and castles. And yet again, white is a very good position. He has a nice central open d-file, and with an inclusion of this bishop on c1 getting into the attack via bishop f4, white should definitely be way better. Now, instead of playing the move bishop e7, you could just play knight e4. But this would allow bishop takes e4, knight f6, bishop g5, and here there are three moves that can be played, queen d6, bishop e7, and h6. If h6 is played, then bishop takes f6, queen f6, queen e2, and here there is a threat of bishop takes b7, bishop takes b7, and queen b5 check, followed by winning the bishop on b7. So this means that black must play a move to defend against this, which is either c6 or a6. If a6 is played, then there's queenside castle, bishop d6, king b1, castles by black, h4, rook to b8, g4, getting ready for an attack, bishop d7, and now knight e5. You could play g5 right away, but knight e5 is a lot better because it centralizes the knight and gets the knight ready for the attack first. Bishop b5 attacking the queen, c4, bishop a4 attacking the rook, b3, bishop backs up to e8. g5 by white, and now the attack has already started. And queen e7. You may be wondering why not just play h takes g5, but after this move is played, you really don't want to get into complications like, first of all, bishop h7 check, and after bishop h7 check is played, if you play king takes h7, then there's this very nice hg5 check move, which gets an attack on the queen and also delivers a check. So that is why you must play king h8, but still after this move, h takes g5, this is already very lost for black. I mean, there's no way to really defend against this. If you play queen takes g5, then after bishop d3 check, king to g8, and then f4, you can see that the position is opening up way too much, and black has barely any resources to keep him alive in the game anymore. So it's best not to play the move h takes g5, because it just gets into too many complications for black. Instead, you could play the move queen e7, but this loses already to g takes h6, and the position is opening up quite too quickly for white, and this is just too bad. So instead of playing the move a6, you could also consider c6, but this would allow knight to e5, threatening knight takes c6 and winning the exchange. Rook to b8, f4, bishop to b4 check, c3, bishop d6, and here castles. After this f4 move is played, you might be wondering why queen takes f4 isn't played, and that's mainly because white can just play rook f1. And if you play queen takes h2, then you just allow moves like castles queenside, even knight takes f7 or rook takes f7. The attack is already coming towards your king if you're black, so I'd best advise you don't capture the pawn on f4. So bishop b4 check instead, c3, bishop to d6, and now castles. Castles by black and queen h5. And white is certainly getting a very good attack out of this. You could consider some moves like knight g4 as white, knight takes h6, even f5, and white is definitely getting out of this on top. So instead of playing the move h6, black could also try bishop e7, but this would allow a trade on f6, queen d3, queen d6, queenside castle, bishop d7, and now knight e5. Capturing the b7 pawn would just allow too much initiative after rook b8, so it's best to just play knight e5. Bishop e5, de5, queen d3, rook d3, and after queenside castle by black and rook hd1, white has a very clear threat of bishop takes b7 check, king takes b7, and rook d7, just winning a pawn. So black would have to defend against that, and after that it's a completely equal position. So that is why after the move bishop to g5, it's best to just play queen d6, and this would allow bishop f6, gf6, and c3, f5, and bishop c2. So keep putting the bishop back on c2 and maybe getting ready to attack the f5 pawn later on in the game. Bishop d7, knight e5, bishop g7, and here there are two moves that white can try. One is knight d7 and another is f4. If f4 is played, then after bishop e5, fe5, queen d5, white plays queen f3, and now black tries to activate the bishop with bishop c6. And here white will play queen takes d5, bishop d5, and castles by white. King e7, bishop b3, challenging the bishop, bishop to e4, not trading yet, but after bishop d1, rook ag8, bishop f3, now black will trade the bishops, and this position is generally considered equal, mainly because there's really no tactics available in this exact position. But that doesn't mean that white isn't better. I mean, he has a very solid pawn chain, and if you look at black's pawn structure, you can see how easy white can attack it. The other move that could be played instead of f4 is actually just knight takes d7, and after queen takes d7, white can play queen h5, and after both sides queen castle queenside, this is the end of the variation. So I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comments section, and stay tuned for more chess.